And as we prepare to take on the last major topic for this course, that of freedom of will, I want to shift discussion to something that overlaps with the topic of freedom of will, as we'll be starting next week. And that brings up the issue, is the relationship between personhood and freedom? We can ask that question by asking ourselves, does it make sense to ask, who or what kind of person would I like to be? That is, many creatures make choices without being able to reflect on or modify the desires that drive those choices. A non-human animal, such as a dog, a mouse, a squirrel, or a bird, makes plenty of choices, it seems, but they don't seem to be able to ask themselves, do I want to be the kind of individual that acts on desires and interests such as these? It's not clear that a dog could ask itself, could I possibly be less bothered by the sight of a squirrel running across the yard in the home where I live? You can imagine a dog saying that, but that would only be mythological. It doesn't seem like a dog has the capacity to try to contemplate the possibility of modifying its own will. Other creatures, however, can reflect on themselves and take measures to modify their own desires. For example, somebody might resolve to be less impressed with status or privilege. Somebody might choose to become a person who procrastinates less or socializes outside their well-known, well-established circle that they've stayed inside from high school, for example. And you can imagine a long list of other ways in which you might try to modify the kind of characteristic behavior patterns that apply to you. You might say, there are some characteristic behavior patterns that apply to me, not all of which I'm crazy about. One person might say, I wish I were better organized. Another person might say, I'm too organized. I'm unduly organized. I wish I could chill out a little bit and be less so in order to be a little bit more likely to roll with the changes and less tight-fisted about the things that are mine. Insofar as one can go about making changes in oneself in response to these desires, one is thereby, as philosophers like to call it, modifying one's will. That is, you're modifying one's will in the following sense. If your will is defined as that set of desires, inclinations, predilections, habits, character traits that tend to make you behave in the typical ways that you do, the disorganized person tends to lose things. The uber and hyper-organized person never loses things and tends to spend a lot of time making sure all the things that he or she has are where they're supposed to be, and all the pencils are sharp and erasers are in good order and so on. The person who's shy tends to avoid encounters, especially with people that they've never met before. A person who is short-tempered tends, of course, to lose their temper and be impolite and conditions of minimal provocation, etc. These are all aspects of a person's will. And one might ask, is it possible to modify one's will? Could I observe my will, think about my will, and do something to modify it, shape it, sculpt it, as it were, into something I prefer that it could be? And most of us would say that seems like a plausible thing to do, even if it's difficult. It still seems possible, especially those at a younger age as opposed to an older. We might get ossified as the years pass and find it more difficult to change our will. But if you're younger, that still is often something that's within your reach. Modifying your will might be a way of exercising freedom as well. So my suggestion is this. We can, as it were, modify or elaborate the self-consciousness theory of synchronic identity. Remember, the self-consciousness theory is the one according to which you're able to consider yourself as a self. And you might elaborate that by saying being a person is also a matter of being able to exercise freedom to modify your will. Of course, doing so requires being able to be to some extent conscious of yourself as a self. You've got to be able to have a theory of your own mind and say, is this the kind of mind, character, etc., that I want to have? And so, according to one theory about synchronic identity, being a person just is a matter of being able to modify your will, that is, to be able to create the kind of will that you would like to have, so that you're not totally in thrall, completely controlled by the will that you were perhaps given, habituated into, raised to have, etc., but rather is something that you could modify, even if doing so is painstaking, takes a long time, a lot of effort, but as long as it's doable, that is perhaps what counts. So on this approach, being a person, if being a person is connected with the capacity to modify one's own will, then being a person is an achievement. It's something that you can struggle to have because you're struggling to make an effort to modify your own will. And it's something that you can also lose the status of. That is to say, you can start life being a person, but if somehow you lose the capacity to modify your will because you're so entrenched in your habits, you're so dug in to your way of living, that you're no longer able to make changes in that aspect of yourself, then you might lose the status of a person, strictly speaking. So the idea is freedom of will. One sense of the term freedom of will might refer to the idea of modifying, exercising the capacity to modify your own will in order to be the kind of person you would like to be. So Shakespeare once said, "As flies to wanton boys are we to the gods. They kill us for their sport." Flies to wanton boys. Where wanton means something like a creature that just follows its desires, follows its instincts, follows its impulses, does not spend any time to reflect on its own desires and instincts and impulses, just behaves accordingly and does what it's going to do, as boys might do to flies. Or what I did when I was young, about 5 years old, my brother and I decided that we had these toys, little toy cars called Hot Wheels, and we decided that not all of our Hot Wheels in our collection were created equal. Both my brother and I got out a hammer and smashed the ones that we thought were not as good as the other ones. And I remember my father looking down at us after we had smashed about half of our Hot Wheels collection in total horror and disgust. And later he said that was a wanton thing to do. It took me about 20 years to figure out what he meant by that, and I think that what he meant was something like this. It was a behavior in which we just acted on impulse. Didn't ask ourselves whether it was right, didn't ask ourselves whether it was proper, didn't ask ourselves whether these other objects might have been better even if we didn't want them, whether it might have been better to give them to other kids that were less fortunate than us, for example. I suspect that I agree at this point that our behavior was wanton, and as such, at that time, I had not, according to this theory of personhood, had not achieved the status of a person. In order to achieve the status of a person, according to this theory, I've got to be able to modify my will. At the time, I didn't seem to have the capacity for that. Maybe it took until I was 10 or 15 before I would have had that capacity. Before, and I might have still had rights to be treated properly and so forth, but that would have been because I was a person in the making, but not a person yet. According to this theory that connects personhood with freedom to modify one's will, then a baby is going to be not yet a person, but likely to be a person, and that's why we still want to protect it. Don't want to use the baby for food or harvesting organs, because doing so would deprive this individual, this biological entity now, the chance of ever becoming a person in the future. So then, being a person in the synchronic sense, according to this theory, is a matter of being able to exercise your freedom of will, and by that I mean freedom to have the will that you choose to have. And again, that's a significant achievement. It's not something that comes easily or naturally. It's not part of your biological endowment just by virtue of being born. It's something that's hard to do, and it's something that can be lost if you don't exercise it at all. So if you don't spend any time in your 80 years of life to reflect on the sort of will that you've got and make any effort whatever to modify it, you might be entirely wanton by the time you're 80, in the sense that you've got your desires, you've got your predilections, you've got your preferences and your dislikes, and you just act on them without responding to any questions about whether these are good or bad things to act on, insofar as you don't engage in the self-examination that Socrates seems to endorse. You could also thereby lose the capacity for personhood because you've lost the capacity to exercise your freedom of will in this broad, robust, and inclusive sense of the term.